On the wind-blasted slopes of Arthur's Seat, where Edinburgh's shadows stretch long and old secrets gather like mist, a discovery was made that would disturb the city for centuries. It began not with scholars or detectives, but with three boys, laughing, chasing, stumbling across something they were never meant to find. Behind a stack of slate stones, in a crevice too small for an adult to notice, lay a secret burial ground no bigger than a child's hands. Tiny wooden coffins, carved with unsettling precision, lined in trembling rows. Inside each, a figure, motionless, dressed, buried. They didn't know it then, but those little coffins carried a darkness far larger than their size. A darkness tied to the most infamous murder spree Edinburgh had ever seen. A darkness that refused to stay buried, because some say the dead cannot rest when justice has been denied. And in those miniature coffins, the dead were waiting for someone, anyone, to find them again. In the summer of 1836, on a quiet hillside of Arthur's Seat, a rocky outcrop near Holyrood Park in Edinburgh, three boys were out hunting rabbits. The day seemed ordinary until one of them noticed something strange. A small opening in the rock, partially sealed with slate stones. Curious, the boys pried away the slate slabs and peered inside. What they discovered would haunt the city's history. A hidden niche holding a set of tiny coffins, each about 3 to 4 inches in length. Inside each coffin lay a miniature wooden figure, dressed from head to toe in tiny cotton clothes, the likeness carved with unnerving detail. The coffins were meticulously crafted from Scots pine, with lids secured by wire sprigs or small brass pins, and studded with delicate tin ornaments. At first, to the boys, these were nothing more than strange toys or curious trinkets, and, in their childish innocence, they began tossing the dolls at each other, treating them like dolls rather than relics of horror. In that chaotic moment, roughly half the coffins were broken or destroyed. Only 8 survived intact. The hillside that overlooked the city would yield no more. The remaining 9, whether lost, destroyed, or reclaimed, vanished with the boys' reckless play. No recordings from the kids exist. Their youthful mischief transformed these eerie artifacts into something dismissed as child's play at the time. Yet those 8 coffins that remained would later be known collectively as the Burke and Hare murder dolls, or sometimes the Lilliputian coffins or fairy coffins, and begin their descent into infamy. Over the next years, word got out that these eerie miniature coffins might not be childish toys at all, but symbolic effigies tied to one of the darkest crime sprees in Edinburgh's history. That crime spree belonged to William Burke and William Hare, 2 Irish immigrants who in the late 1820s made their living in the blood-chilling trade of murder and cadavers. Edinburgh's medical schools were desperate for bodies for dissection. Legal supply was limited to executed criminals, suicides, or orphaned infants, which meant legitimate bodies were extremely rare. When a lodger in Hare's boarding house died of natural causes, the pair realized they could cash in. They sold the corpse to a local anatomist, and a gruesome idea dawned. Why wait for death by natural causes when they could supply more fresh bodies themselves? Thus began a string of murders that would eventually number about 16 victims over the span of roughly 10 months between 1827 and 1828. In a grim sequence, Burke and Hare lured vulnerable people, drifters, the poor, or lodgers, into their home, plied them with drink until they lost consciousness, and then suffocated them while leaving no outward sign of violence. Their method was chillingly consistent. Once the victim was dead, their body was sold to a medical school cadaver broker. The financial returns were enough to fuel their crimes. Each body fetched around 7 to 10 pounds, a very high sum at the time. As the corpses continued to flow into the hands of anatomists, suspicion grew across Edinburgh, but no one could quite pin down the source. Legal grave robbers, or resurrection men, had long operated in the underworld, digging up fresh graves and selling bodies for dissection. But Burke and Hare's crimes were different. These bodies were not stolen from graves, but newly murdered people, killed in cold blood. It was a horrifying escalation of an already macabre trade. Ultimately, their spree ended in grotesque irony. Their final victim, a middle-aged woman named Margaret Docherty, also variously called Mary, Madgie, or Madge, was lured under false pretenses that Burke claimed she was a relative and plied with whiskey until she became drunk. He and Hare, along with accomplices, killed her and hid her body among straw in their lodging house. That corpse, when discovered by lodgers the next morning, tipped off the police. The body, however, had already been whisked to the local anatomist, but forensic examination by medical specialists found evidence strongly suggesting suffocation. That led to the arrest of Burke, Hare, and their accomplices. Under the pressure of mounting testimony and growing horror at the scope of their crimes, a deal was struck. Hare agreed to become a witness for the Crown, a king's evidence, in exchange for immunity. He pointed the finger squarely at Burke as the main killer, though suspicions remained about wider complicity. The trial began, but prosecutors could only strictly prove a handful of the murders, including Margaret Docherty's. Nevertheless, it was enough. Burke was found guilty and in January 1829 publicly hanged before a swelling crowd of over 20,000. His body was then handed over to the anatomists, the very kind who had bought the bodies of his victims. His skeleton and other grisly souvenirs, such as a death mask, were preserved. But where do the miniature coffins fit into this horrifying tapestry of crime and anatomy? That is the great mystery, one that continues to divide historians to this day. When the original 8 coffins, after the rest were lost or destroyed by teenage mischief, were examined, several curious things stood out. The fabrics used for the tiny burial clothes dated to the same era as the murders, roughly the 1820s. The coffins themselves were arranged in 3 levels in the niche, 2 tiers of 8 and 1 lonely solitary coffin at the top. The lower coffins showed more signs of decay, whereas the topmost one looked much newer, as if added last. This led many to speculate the coffins were deposited over time, possibly corresponding to the deaths of victims as they occurred. Moreover, the craftsmanship was too refined to be random juvenile carving. Smooth woodwork, well-fitted lids, precise tin studs, and metal adornments, suggesting someone with skill and intention. The wooden figures inside were all uniformly carved, dressed in male attire, with black painted feet, like wearing boots. One figure even had its arms removed before being placed in its coffin, a macabre touch that suggested reworking rather than toy-making. This has led to the haunting theory that the dolls were symbolic representations of the victims, perhaps a remorseful maker's gesture, a secret funeral for souls who received no proper burial. Alternative theories also emerged. Some speculated the dolls had nothing to do with murder victims. They could have been effigies for lost sailors, or part of obscure folk rituals, or even memorials for political insurgents. One historian argues the coffins represent victims of the Radical War of 1820, rather than the murders. Another theory proposes the coffins were placed as symbolic burials for people whose actual remains were buried at sea or lost. Over the decades, as the dolls passed from one curious collector to another, stories about their origin morphed from rumor to legend, but none established truth. After their discovery, the set first came into the hands of the boys' schoolmaster, who reportedly showed them to his archaeological society. They then passed to a jeweler who displayed them as curiosities. By about 1845, the set, or what was left of it, was auctioned for a mere £4, a pittance compared to the price bodies fetched just a few decades earlier. Private collectors retained the dolls through the rest of the 19th century. Some disappeared, some were lost or destroyed, until in 1901, 8 of the coffins were donated to the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. The rest remain missing to this day. Despite this museum acquisition, questions haunted historians. Who carved them? Why? And are they really linked to the murders of Burke and Hare, or only a fascinating coincidence? Some propose that the maker was one of the murderers, perhaps guilt-ridden, and secretly buried the dolls to atone. Others suspect someone else entirely, maybe an unknown sympathizer, placing symbolic coffins for unknown dead. DNA tests have been attempted on the dolls, but yielded nothing conclusive. No match could be made to any known victim. The fact that all dolls are male, though many known victims were women, also casts serious doubt. Thus the mystery endures. The dolls may be genuine, they may be hoaxes, they may be tributes or macabre souvenirs, or something more spiritual or political. Their origin remains unknown, and so does their meaning. Today, the tale of the Burke and Hare murder dolls stands as one of those eerie intersections between crime, morality, folklore, and memory. On one hand, there is the brutal reality of the murders committed by Burke and Hare, pragmatic, cold-blooded killings, driven by profit and facilitated by the demand of medical schools for cadavers. On the other hand, there is the almost poetic, if deeply unsettling, possibility that someone tried to honor their victims in the only way left, through miniature coffins and effigies. Perhaps those tiny wooden bodies represent guilt, remorse, or a plea for remembrance. Or perhaps they were a bizarre prank that inadvertently tapped a deep public fear, taking on mythic significance over time. Whatever the truth, the dolls remain. To this day, the ones in the museum still sit quietly in their little pine sarcophagi, clothed in their faded cotton, heads bowed in silent repose. Their creator remains anonymous. Their story remains unfinished. And the people who died because of Burke and Hare, those 16 souls and perhaps more, are long gone. Yet in those small coffins, tiny figures whisper a story of greed, of death, of haunting memory, and of unanswered questions. Some mysteries are meant to be solved. Others, like the Burke and Hare murder dolls, remind us how little we sometimes know, how easily history can slip beyond grasp, and how even the smallest things can carry the deepest weight. In the museum's dim glass case, the tiny coffins still rest, silent, untouched, unexplained. Their maker forgotten, their purpose uncertain. Yet anyone who looks closely feels the same chilling truth. Some secrets were never meant to stay buried.